This video was made for educational purposes only.
Hello, my fellow thrill seekers, and welcome back to Mostly Mysteries, where we unravel the unknown. In the dim recesses of history, secrets lie buried, waiting to be unearthed. From ancient enigmas to modern-day rabbit holes, we delve into the eerie, the inexplicable, and the spine-chilling. So, fasten your seatbelts and prepare to journey with us through the shadows, where every twist and turn reveals a new layer of intrigue. So before we get started, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and slap that like button with notifications turned on. Now that we got that out of the way, you can put on your tinfoil hats because today we have more mysterious content so you can fill your fix. Well, without any further ado, let's jump into today's mystery. Utah, with its rugged landscapes, ancient history, and vast wilderness, has long been a canvas for tales of the supernatural. Among the whispers of the desert winds and the shadows cast by the red rock formations lies a place that defies explanation. A place some call a paranormal playground, while some even go as far as to say that it's one of the most active paranormal hotspots on the planet. Skinwalker Ranch is a 512-acre plot of land near Ballard, Utah, that has become synonymous with paranormal phenomena, UFO sightings, and inexplicable events, so much so that 3 out of 4 people in the region have experienced something paranormal. The name Skinwalker itself evokes a sense of unease. Derived from Navajo folklore, it refers to a malevolent witch capable of shape-shifting into any creature it desires. Typically, these beings take the form of 4-legged mammals like coyotes, but they can also appear as owls or crows. Skeptics dismiss this as a mere myth, but eyewitness accounts spanning decades tell a different story. Over the years, the ranch has had quite a few owners, all of which reported strange activity on the property. These reports include everything from UFO sightings, crop circles, animal mutilations, cryptid sightings, shadow men, electromagnetic anomalies, and sightings of interdimensional beings. For most of the 1900s, Skinwalker Ranch was owned by a family that is still pretty much unknown to this very day. All that we really know is that the family seemed to up and leave the property in a hurry in 1987, leaving Skinwalker Ranch abandoned for 7 years until Terry and Gwen Sherman came along and bought the property in 1994. The couple was ecstatic, believing that they had just purchased their dream house for a fraction of its true worth. The property was quite remote and bordered a high ridge to the north, which overlooked its green pastures, wild thickets of woodland, and its flowing creek to the south. The entire estate exuded an almost tranquil beauty. Terry was a career high-end cattle breeder, so purchasing the ranch was a no-brainer, providing security, lots of space and privacy due to its remote location. Not to mention, Terry bought the land for just a fraction of what it was truly worth. So much so, Terry was in disbelief when the transaction was finalized. For Terry, this was the deal of a lifetime, and a dream come true. But what Terry didn't realize at the time was this purchase would actually turn out nothing short of a living nightmare that would almost ruin him mentally and financially. Gwen and Terry knew that the property had been abandoned for some time, so they expected that they were going to have to do a bit of restoration to the housing, but they didn't expect to find the excessive amounts of deadbolts and other locks not just on both the front and back doors, but on all the windows too. Also, at the front and back doors, bolted into the walls, were large metal rungs with heavy-duty chains attached to them like they were used to chain up large gourd dogs or something. Gwen and Terry thought this was strange, but didn't really give it much thought. Another thing the Shermans found odd were the strange clauses listed in the real estate contract when buying the property. For example, the Shermans weren't permitted to dig on the property without being approved by the previous owners first. These things were overlooked at first, but not without Terry asking himself, what was the previous resident so afraid of? Not knowing that it was only a matter of time before the Sherman family would realize that the land they now called home was a hot spot for the strange and mysterious. On the first day they moved onto the property, the Sherman family was unloading some furniture off of their truck when they spotted something lurking on the south side of the pasture. As it got closer, they were able to identify what it was. It was a wolf, and it was closing the distance at a steady pace, headed in their direction. Terry immediately took guard. It wasn't long before he noticed that the wolf he was looking at was at least 3 or 4 times the size of a normal wolf. And what was even stranger was the wolf's behavior. The wolf was approaching them with its tail wagging, giving off an unusually friendly vibe. As it approached the family nonchalantly, it stopped about 50 yards away. It began to sniff the air while it gazed in the family's direction before it started walking towards them again, without a care in the world. It continued to wag its tail as it approached. So Terry's father, seeing how tame the enormous wolf seemed, reached his hand out and began to stroke the beast. After seeing that the wolf wasn't displaying any aggressiveness, the rest of the family let their guard down and began to make their way over to greet their unexpected visitor. Maybe it's somebody's pet? Terry wondered, as he looked nervously at the corral that was only about 50 feet to his right, thinking that it may not have been smart to move some of his herd to the ranch so soon. Inside the pen was 4 of his cows he used to breed along with some of his calves. They all seemed scared of the wolf's presence, except for one curious young calf, which was sticking its head out between the metal bars, seeing what all the commotion was. As soon as Terry realized what was unfolding, the wolf had already made his way to the pen and wrapped his huge jaws around the calf's head and neck area. The calf thrashed around violently, with pouring from his neck as the wolf tried pulling him out of the pen. That's when Terry grabbed a handle to an axe from the back of his truck and rushed over to fend off the wolf. Terry began beating the wolf while kicking it in its legs, but it wasn't fazing the enormous wolf in the slightest bit. Once Terry realized he had no effect on the beast, he yelled for someone to grab his .357 Magnum from the truck. With the weapon in hand, he proceeded to making contact with the beast's stomach area. But the wolf didn't even so much as flinch. So Terry fired another, but still, it had no effect on the beast. So Terry once more and made contact with the wolf's upper body. It wasn't until then that the wolf let go of the calf and backed up about 15 or 20 feet. The wolf just stood there staring back at Terry. That's when Terry noticed that the wolf didn't have any on its fur, nor did it seem injured. Terry was shocked, wondering how any animal could survive 3 shots from point-blank range from a .357 and survive, let alone walk away unscathed. So Terry raised his firearm once more and hit the enormous wolf directly in the chest. After that, the wolf backed up about another 30 feet before turning back around to begin watching the calf again. There was something unsettling about the way the wolf just sat there with an unconcerned look, contemplating whether to attack the calf again or not. Realizing this, Terry yelled for his son to get his .30-06 rifle from the house, which he did in a matter of seconds. His son raised the weapon and easily found the enormous wolf in his scope due to his size and the fact that the beast was sitting still. Feeling sorry for the beast, he fired a shot hitting the wolf in his left shoulder, blowing off a chunk of flesh. But the wolf didn't drop to the ground as any other animal would have after a shot like that. It just stood up, staring back at Terry and his son. They took another shot at the wolf, but this shot whizzed right past the wolf's head, clipping his ear. The wolf then started trotting away. Terry knew that if he was going to raise cattle on the ranch, he had to make sure he took care of this wolf problem to ensure the safety of his livestock, so he and his son followed after the beast to finish the job. They followed the wolf for about half an hour, catching glimpses of it as it ran between patches of cottonwoods and other trees. They ended up losing track of the wolf. But they soon ran into a creek with a mud bank on the other side where they could see the wolf's paw prints. After finding the prints, they began following in the direction of the prints. But the tracks eventually stopped about 50 yards from the edge of the water. This completely baffled Terry and his son, because they were standing dead center in a wide open field made of mud, yet the footprints abruptly stopped. That meant the wolf would have had to jump 5 or more yards in either direction to avoid leaving any more tracks in the mud. It was as if the enormous wolf disappeared into thin air. After losing sight of the beast, Terry and his son made their way back to the house. Upon arrival, they came across the chunk of flesh that was left behind by the wolf when they shot him with the .30-06. But the chunk of flesh left Terry and his son troubled because the flesh wasn't fresh and covered with blood like it should have been. It looked and smelled rotten as if it had been left out in the sun for a couple of days. The next couple weeks were pretty normal, except for a few strange occurrences which happened around the house and were all targeted towards Gwen. Initially thinking she was having a mental breakdown, she kept the matter to herself, not wanting to worry Terry. One example of these occurrences goes like this. One day after Gwen returned home from the store, she took the groceries into the house and proceeded to put them away. When she was finished, she left the room to attend to another matter. But she returned to the kitchen to find all the groceries she had just put away, all put back in their bags and placed on the table as if she hadn't just unpacked them and put them away. Another strange occurrence is sometimes when Gwen would take a morning shower, she would enter the bathroom, lock the door behind her, and leave her towel and hairbrush on the toilet. When she was done, she would get out of the shower to find her towel and hairbrush missing, only to find them hours or even sometimes days later in a random spot in the house. Gwen started to become deeply worried about her mental state until one day Terry came in the house asking if someone had taken his post digger. He had been using it to repair a fence on the property when he turned away for just a few seconds. But when he turned back to face the fence, it was gone. Gwen explained that she and the kids had been in the house all evening and started to help him search for it. But no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find it anywhere. Then, 2 weeks later, while Terry was out doing work on the opposite side of the ranch, he happened to look up, and there it was. It was about 80 feet up a tree. Terry was absolutely dumbfounded due to the piece of equipment weighing between 70 and 80 pounds. By now, you probably can guess that the Sherman family suspected that something weird was going on with the land they recently decided to call home. Just a week before the incident with the post digger occurred, one of Terry and Gwen's nephews came to stay for a couple days. While he was there, Terry decided to give him the grand tour. During this tour, they were also accompanied by Terry's son. It was well after nightfall when they decided to end the tour and head back to the house. As they headed back, the group noticed a set of headlights near the fence line. This wasn't the first time Terry noticed the lights and figured it was just someone who was lost and made a wrong turn on the property. But now that he was seeing the lights for a second time, he thought that it may have been poachers hunting illegally on his land, so he wanted to confront whoever it was and let them know they were on private property. But as he headed in the direction of the lights began to move away from him. The faster he walked, the faster the lights began to move away. It got to the point that Terry and the boys began to jog until they closed the distance to around 100 yards. That's when the lights suddenly lifted off of the ground and flew up over the treetops. Terry and the boys stopped as they watched in disbelief as the light continued to rise until they flew out of sight. These lights started to become a frequent occurrence, especially during the fall when Terry started transporting his prize Simmental and Angus cattle on the ranch. Around this time, things began to escalate with the arrival of his high-end livestock. One late evening, Terry was riding horseback, searching for one of his prize Angus cows that had been missing for almost a whole 24 hours. He had covered the entire ranch, except for a dense area of woodland to the southwest, which he was now heading towards. As he approached the large outcropping of trees, he was relieved to see hoof prints in the snow and knew he was close to finding the cow. He followed the hoof prints for about 25 yards into the trees and then into a wide clearing. The tracks lead into the middle of the clearing and then came to a complete stop. But the cow was nowhere to be found. How could this be, he thought, as he stood there dumbfounded. Then he remembered how the wolf tracks had stopped in the same fashion, as if the animal disappeared into thin air. He searched the area for clues, but to no avail. Losing cattle was financially and mentally devastating. But Terry had no other options other than to head back to the house empty-handed. Over the first winter on the ranch, a total of 5 cows or bulls would go missing, not knowing what else to do. Terry began staying up at all hours of the night, creeping around the ranch in the shadows, looking for anything out of the ordinary, trying to catch whatever was taking his livestock. But no matter what he did, whatever was snatching his cattle remained elusive. Terry began to think that the lights he'd been seeing on his land had something to do with it. So, any time he seen them, which was quite often, Terry would try to creep up close to get a good look at them, but the lights would always fly away like they knew he was close to them somehow. But then, in the early hours of the morning, after another long night, he was making his way back toward the house when a movement to the left of him caught his attention. To his amazement, it was a black mass hovering over the ground about 100 yards to his left, hovering right above the gleaming white snow. To him, it looked like a small, short-nosed version of a F-117 Nighthawk. But he knew that couldn't have been an F-117 because this thing made no sound whatsoever as it floated about 15 feet above the ground, defying gravity. The craft shined different colored lights along the ground as it flew across the land as it was searching the snow for something. Terry watched the craft for about 20 minutes as it went from east to west and back again. As Terry stood up, his muscles cracked from being crouched down for so long. Even though the sound wouldn't have been heard by the human ear more than a few feet away, it was as if the craft could hear the noise somehow. Because as soon as his muscles cracked all the lights on, the craft suddenly went out. The craft came to a stop and turned in Terry's direction. He was paralyzed with shock. Terry stared at the craft nervously as it analyzed him for a few moments before it turned around and flew north until it was out of sight. As the winter turned to spring, the missing cattle began to show back up on the ranch, sometimes heavily mutilated and other times it seemed like they had no signs of death at all. It was quite bizarre. Sometimes huge chunks of flesh, skin, and even organs were removed from the bodies, but yet there wasn't any blood. Not only weren't there any stains of blood around the wounds or on the fur of the cattle, but it seemed that all the blood had been completely drained from the bodies altogether. Also, all the cuts on the bodies seemed to be done with surgical precision. Throughout 1995, the strange occurrences intensified. It seemed as the days progressed, the more unexplainable the events became. Almost every single night, the lights appeared over the property. Also, the paranormal activity ramped up significantly in the house. Shadow people began to appear all over the house. Sometimes they would catch glances of them peering through the windows or standing over their beds, watching them as they slept. They would also hear strange noises coming from the ground, as if there were machinery or even trains operating right beneath their feet. The neighbors also heard the noises. They also heard disembodied voices, speaking in strange languages coming from the sky. They also spotted weird-looking animals lurking on the property, from strange humanoids resembling Bigfoot to terrifying canines that resembled an oversized hyena that sometimes attacked the cattle. They also witnessed an invisible entity or a creature with a cloaking ability that they can only describe as being like the alien in the movie The Predator. But the most intriguing thing they witnessed was the stationary orange light that would sometimes appear in the sky over the property. The first time Terry witnessed this anomaly, he was sitting on his porch on a beautiful summer evening when something suddenly appeared in the sky about a mile away. He happened to be cleaning one of his rifles moments before, so his high-powered scope was sitting nearby. He picked up the scope and proceeded to view the object through the scope's high-powered lens. And what he saw troubled him. He couldn't believe his eyes. So he lowered the scope, took a deep breath, and looked again. The object looked to be some kind of portal opened up in the sky. By this time, it was already nightfall, so the sky all around him was pitch black, besides the stars and the orange light emanating from around the portal. And on the other side of the portal was a bright blue sky. He would begin seeing these portals on a regular basis, sometimes even witnessing different types of crafts flying in and out of them. But the most terrifying anomalies on the ranch were the orbs. They were about the size of a baseball and blood-red orange. These were a bit less common than the others, but when they did, they were far more aggressive and would sometimes mess with the cattle. But sometimes, larger blue ones would show up, and when they did, it was usually bad news. They would give you extreme anxiety if you got too close to them. Gwen and Terry feared the blue orbs more than anything else they came in contact with on the ranch. One evening, while Terry was out on his porch, he saw one of the blue orbs in the tree line in front of the house. 3 of his hunting dogs were sitting on the porch next to him. When they noticed the orb approaching the porch, they began to bark and growl. The orb started to head back towards the trees when all 3 dogs took off after it. The dogs chased it into the trees and just out of sight when all of a sudden, Terry heard 3 painful yelps. And then, nothing but silence. An hour or so went past before he noticed the dogs still hadn't returned. He was too afraid to venture into the wooded area during the night, so he waited until morning to go search for them. So after the sun came up, he and his son went out to look for the dogs. But all they found was 3 cauterized piles of flesh, still smoldering in the morning air. This event happened to be the straw that broke the camel's back. That was all the Sherman family could endure. After 2 long years of no sleep and constantly being on edge, they were calling it quits. Not to mention the kids weren't doing so well in school, Gwen lost her job at the bank, and the entire family slept in the same room together due to being terrified from all the strange activity going on in and around their house at all hours of the night. And to top it all off, they had lost family pets and 14 head of cattle and were on the verge of bankruptcy. They didn't realize the danger they were in until the morning they found their dogs vaporized. It wasn't until Terry and Gwen told a local newspaper about what was going on at the ranch that the story was picked up by another publication and ultimately caught the attention of billionaire businessman Robert T. Bigelow. At the time, Bigelow had recently invested a good amount of money into a scientific team whose purpose was to investigate events of high strangeness. Bigelow agreed to purchase the ranch. The Sherman were more than happy to sell and were all moved out by July of 1996. Bigelow's team, the National Institute for Discovery Science, also known as NIDS, moved into the ranch in September of 1996. They stayed and studied the ranch for nearly a whole decade and claimed to study various accounts of bizarre phenomena. But you're going to have to tune back in for part 2 to hear the terrifying encounters made by the NIDS team.